Well, hello, and welcome to today's episode of Breaking the Taboo. And regular listeners will be surprised to have a second episode out this week, but you've probably seen the news headlines about maternity dominating the news. So we've got today as a special bonus episode to talk about the stories behind the headlines. And I'm delighted to welcome to the studio today Hannah Barnes, who is the investigations editor of the New Statesman and previously worked at the BBC. And she's an award-winning journalist and writer whose books have been shortlisted for the Baillie Gifford and Orwell Prizes. You've probably seen her story this week on the cover of the New Statesman, looking at Britain's Next Maternity Scandal and her 4-month-long investigation into Oxford University's Hospital Trust. And if I could just start off the episode, Hannah, with giving listeners a bit of background as to where we are in maternity care in the UK. And this relates to many of the topics we've discussed previously on the series. But according to the Quality Care Commission, nearly half of England's maternity units require improvement or are currently rated inadequate. And in the past decade, 3 major investigations have reported on maternity failings at individual hospital trusts. And we also know that a 4th is currently reviewing the treatment of nearly 2,500 families underway in Nottingham, and now a 5th confirmed in October in Leeds. So I think it's fair to say that this failure is now endemic and systemic. And we know that the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has now called it a national scandal. And this chimes with many of the recommendations and findings that we found in the birth trauma inquiry, which I co-chaired last year with Rosie Duffield MP. And also, for some background for listeners, in June, Wes Streeting announced a national maternity and neonatal investigation. Too many children had been dying, he said, and in September it was confirmed that 14 maternity trusts would be put under the microscope in a rapid review as part of that investigation, led by the Labour peer Baroness Valerie Amos. Since then, 2 trusts have been removed from the list, but the inclusion of one, Oxford University Hospitals NHS Foundation Trust, did not come as a surprise to the New Statesman. And Hannah, you've been investigating this with Channel 4 News and looking at maternity care in the trust by speaking with women whose care spans from 2009 until this year. What were your key findings?
It's hard to convey how awful, really, the stories of care we heard were. Between myself and Channel 4 News, we spoke to 24 women, sometimes their partners as well, and we heard harrowing accounts of stillbirths, of babies dying very shortly after birth, of lifelong physical injuries to mothers and to babies left severely brain damaged, long-lasting mental trauma to women. We heard a complete failure in postnatal care, a lack of compassion, something that you spoke about a lot in the inquiry last year into birth trauma, women feeling like they weren't listened to, they weren't treated with compassion, they felt like pieces of meat. And all of this was compounded really by what you can describe as a defensive attitude by Oxford University hospitals when women complained or actually just asked questions about what had happened to them during the births. And we also heard some rather extraordinary tales of attempts to the reaction to certain women when they spoke out about the harm that they'd received.
Well, it was really quite shocking, actually, to read your report. And there were some really shocking stories in there of families. And I wonder, to kind of set out the context of what we're talking about today, if you wouldn't mind sharing 2 of them. I think the first that really struck home to me was the very shocking and sad story about Emma's twins, Hope and Lily. And perhaps you could tell us what happened in that scenario and why it's such a devastating example of why we really need to grip and improve maternity care and safety in the UK.
This story is truly astonishing. Emma Cox was 17 back in 2011 and she was pregnant with twins, and it was a very difficult pregnancy. There was a rare medical complication with the twins, and one was getting more of the nutrients from the placenta than the other one, and it was looking quite complicated. She went into spontaneous labour at 24 weeks. delivered both twins, Hope and Lily, and was told that one, Lily, which had been the smallest one that had been tracked through the pregnancy, had died, and the other, Hope, was not in a very good condition either, and she was taken to neonatal intensive care. Now, at some point later, a midwife, Emma told us, appears with Lily wrapped up in hospital blankets, and she says the mortuary won't take her. And Emma and her partner and her parents say, why? And the response that comes back is because she's still breathing. And this tiny, tiny baby is handed to Emma, and they don't really know what to do. Having thought that she was dead, Lily is there, pink, little hands and feet moving, so Emma remembers, but she's really cold. And so they, before doing anything, they say to this midwife, well, can she go to neonatal intensive care and be with her sister? And the answer that comes back, she recalls, is no, because there's been too much damage already, because she hasn't received any care up to that point. So they place Lily, I mean, it just sounds utterly barbaric, but they place Lily on a radiator. That's all they can do to try to keep her warm, while no medical assistance is available. And as the hours go on, it's clear that Lily's sister Hope isn't doing very well in intensive care. And after 12 hours of being alive, Hope dies. Lily, however, who received no medical intervention whatsoever, survives for a further 12 hours. So within 24 hours of Emma's birth, both her baby girls had passed away. And when Channel 4 News and I spoke with Emma, this was actually the first time, this is the longest conversation she'd ever had about this awful, unimaginable experience, bearing in mind it was 14 years ago. And she remembers they made a complaint to the hospital at the time, and they went for a follow-up meeting, and all really she wanted to know was, had you intervened, might Lily have survived? And they said, she remembers, there's a chance that she would have, but she would have been very severely disabled. And Emma feels very strongly that that was her choice to make and not the hospital's. And she feels certainly that her age at the time, 17, was a factor in this. She felt that there was this paternalistic kind of attitude that she was the recipient of, a sort of doctor knows best. And for many, many years, Emma just, well, she's battled with this. She hasn't, as I say, she's not had a long conversation about it. She can't bring herself to look at any of the photos of the twins. Everything related to their very short lives is in a little box in the garage in her parents' house. But she wants answers now, and she's asked for her medical notes, actually, because she just can't understand, well, A, how she was under the impression that one child had died and then she hadn't, but also why she wasn't able to receive any care. I mean, they were in a very tricky position, the babies. Who knows whether they would have survived or not, but really the way she was treated is really quite harrowing. And really for many, many years believed that this was a one-off case and other women were receiving better care, or you'd hope they would. And then she came across a Facebook group, only this summer actually, where over 600 women were sharing their experiences of harm during their births of their children at the same hospital. This was the John Radcliffe, which is part of the Oxford University Hospitals Trust. And that's why she's decided to speak out now, really, because she can't believe that similar patterns, albeit not as extreme as this absolutely horrendous case, but she saw patterns in the stories of other women, sort of a lack of compassion, almost a lack of informed consent, not being able to make the decisions about their own children and their own bodies. And that's why she's spoken out now.
Well, firstly, Hannah, the story that you just described is definitely one of the most shocking that I've ever heard and read. And I remember reading over 1,000 stories for the birth trauma inquiry of, really shocking examples of postnatal care or medical negligence in some reasons from different hospital trusts across the country. But that really is truly astonishing. And I think that NHS professionals, need to be held accountable. And we need to have a frank discussion, I think, in the UK about maternity care and systems. And you mentioned that there's actually a huge number of families in Oxford who've been directly affected. And you talked about some of the patterns emerging across the 24 women that you interviewed. So could you just give us a sense of what are the types of kind of failures in their care which you've identified across different families?
Well, we certainly found, and this was supported, if you like, by those who've litigated against the trust for many, many years. We certainly found a lack of choice being given to women at all parts of their pregnancy and birth. So that might be how they give birth, whether that's a midwife-led unit or an obstetrician-led unit, and when. So if they were induced or what have you. And it goes back to that kind of paternalistic attitude that you might not provide all of the information that women need in order to make the decisions that are right for them. And I just want to sort of make clear, it's not about choosing just for the sake of it. Obviously, this is informed choice, doing the things that are safest and best for you, and doctors stepping in when things are seemingly going wrong. We also heard this sort of delay in escalation when it was clear to women that something was going wrong with their babies. There seemed to be a reluctance to act as quickly as possible. One of the things we found in relation to this kind of lack of choice was that for many years, it only ended in 2021, the trust flatly denied maternal request caesarean sections. So that's when a woman wants a caesarean, but there's no strict medical need for it. Now, NICE, the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, have had in their guidance since 2011 that, yes, it's fine for a hospital to explain the benefits of a vaginal birth and the risks of caesareans and vice versa. Obviously, both methods carry risks and benefits, but ultimately, if a woman still wanted a caesarean section, then they should give it. But Oxford didn't do that. They would sometimes send women to other hospitals many, many miles away from where they lived, out into different counties. I heard about Gloucester, in some cases, Reading, so the Royal Berkshire, and others. And then we came across, it seemed that sort of willingness to go against national guidelines was still going on now, but in a very different area in terms of a scanning pathway and what the hospital were doing. And then I think in terms of postnatal care, it was just really a complete lack of compassion and dignity. I mean, one thing that was really surprising and quite shocking that came up in terms of postnatal care was women being asked and required to change their own catheters. Now, it was really quite disturbing. Like, several women said that they were left with these overflowing catheter bags, obviously making them feel really quite dirty as well, as like urine is coming out, and they were expected to change them. I mean, and things that you heard in the inquiry, being left in bloodstained sheets and gowns, and lack of pain relief for many, many hours, lack of food in some cases.
Well, it's so unacceptable to hear all of those examples, Hannah. And what really strikes me about what you're talking about is how I think a lot of this stems down to national guidance not being followed. And I think there's a first part of that question of is guidance enough? Because it's not actually mandatory, right, for hospital trusts for enacting these policies. And then there's the second point about the culture, I think, within Oxford of is that why they interpreted the care in this particular way and clearly didn't provide a high enough level of care?
Well, the guidance question is an interesting one because Channel 4 and we spoke with Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary. We took our findings to him, and he's now asked NHS England to look into specific allegations that we've unearthed. And one is this potential flouting of national guidelines in a particular area. And the Health Secretary makes the point, which all obstetricians will say as well, is that guidance is guidance, but that is so that we don't shut down medical advances, innovation, and potential things that can make care better and safer. So that's why it's guidance and it's not the law. However, if a trust or a unit or a doctor is going against national guidelines, they have to be able to show that what they are doing is, in fact, safer and better for their patients and provides better outcomes. And it's not at all clear in this case that Oxford is currently able to show that. So that's the importance of guidelines, I guess. You ask about the culture. I mean, it's certainly something that came up when we were talking to lawyers. That they sort of made this point that they hadn't really seen a trust as defensive as Oxford University hospitals when litigating against other hospitals when it comes to maternity care. It does seem, and certainly women felt, whether it's, there was certainly a perception that because the hospital has this Oxford University brand, it's part of the university, that there was this kind of let's defend this reputation to the hilt. And certainly several women I spoke to who they were physically fine in the end and their babies were physically fine, but they'd had these horrendous experiences. And then several were told that, they were lucky that they had been at Oxford because it's so good. So there certainly was a sense there. And some of the things that have happened to the most vocal campaigners sort of point to this desire to protect the trust. I mean, I should say that certainly the trust would not accept that, and actually they have apologised to all the women that we feature across both our written investigation and Channel 4's films that have received care that was way below the standard they should expect. They sent their sincere condolences to any family whose child has died under their care, and they are committed to improving.
Well, I hope they're committed to improving, because the stories that you've uncovered this week, Hannah, are quite frankly astonishing, and they need to take urgent action. I just think it'd be helpful to listeners to know what Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, has said to you. So I know you put to him the specific examples of this failing in Oxford, and he said that the revelations were scandalous and pointed to a moral failure in the system overall. And he continued, and I quote, "I'm concerned about the extent to which we've got a cultural problem across the NHS where protecting the reputation of the NHS and of trusts, sparing the blushes of executive leaders and clinicians, is prioritised over and above doing the right thing by patients." And I think that is really the nub of what you were just describing, Hannah, of that clearly it is the job of hospitals to provide safe levels of care, and for the public to have trust that when they go to give birth, that they and their baby are going to be well looked after. And unfortunately, I think your report shows that trust is now clearly broken.
Well, there were clearly problems at Oxford, because it is one of the 12 units that Baroness Amos is rapidly reviewing as part of her investigation. In fact, she has been there this week. So on Wednesday and Thursday, the 5th and 6th of November, she and her team were on the ground in Oxford. So there were already problems identified by whoever made the decision of which units to choose. And I think that what we've uncovered just takes it to another level, really. There are clearly problems here. I think it's unquestionable.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that really struck me reading your very hard-hitting report, Hannah, was you talk about the data on stillbirth rates. And I noted that in 2023, the last year for which the data was available, that the OUH actually had the worst stillborn rate in the country. And according to official perinatal mortality figures, OUH's stillbirth rate has been graded red. So that's at least 5% higher than the average for comparable trusts. And that reminded me of another really incredibly sad and shocking story that you had about Alice and Pedro's baby, Smokey, and how she obviously, in my view, had clearly a high-risk pregnancy. So what did her story reveal to you all about kind of monitoring, induction timing, and kind of independent investigations about these issues?
It's another absolutely heartbreaking story. And can I just say at this point, actually, that I'm exceptionally grateful. I know you've done it as well, Theo, but I'm exceptionally grateful to all of the women that spoke with us. It's exceptionally difficult to relive these horrendous moments of your life, the worst of your life, and to tell them to a complete stranger. So we are only able to uncover these things and paint this broader picture because women are brave enough to talk to us. So thank you to all of them. Yes, in Alice's case, it was a high risk pregnancy. It was noted that this was the case from at least 20 weeks. There were some risk factors identified early on which showed that the baby Smokey might be at risk of sort of growth restriction. The flow of blood in the placenta from mum Alice to the baby wasn't quite as you'd hope. So there were some risk factors there already. And then very late in the pregnancy, was sort of 36 weeks plus, Alice developed gestational hypertension, so high blood pressure in pregnancy, and possible preeclampsia. It did turn out to be preeclampsia, but it was quite unclear at the time. And yet, despite these high risk factors, which are all we are known to be contributory factors to stillbirths, it was agreed with Alice that she could be induced past 41 weeks, so 41 weeks plus 2. Now, I'm sure all your listeners are very au fait with birth, but that is late. Especially for a high-risk pregnancy. Between ourselves and Channel 4 News, we spoke with 4 independent obstetricians who all said that in Alice's situation, they would have induced by 39 weeks. No attempt was made to bring her induction forward. They assured her that this was fine, what she had asked for, because she didn't know it was so dangerous. That wasn't explained to her. It was accepted. At 40 weeks, Alice became very, very worried that things weren't right. Her bump measurement had dropped, which was an indication that Smokey wasn't growing as she should be, and as had been highlighted many, many weeks before, that this was a risk. And she asked for a scan. In fact, her midwife referred her for a scan. Unbeknown to her, this scan was denied, and she called the hospital 44 times on one day. This was 2 or 3 days after that scan request had gone in, and to try and get an answer to what had happened. A second referral was actually made, which was also denied. Now, unbeknown to Alice at the time, the obstetrician that turned down the request had actually said, I recommend that we bring forward the induction, but nobody told Alice this. Now, why this is so important is several things. So firstly, in high-risk pregnancies, all the national guidelines we have, whether that's NICE, whether it's the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or it comes from the Saving Babies' Lives bundle, it says in high-risk pregnancies, you should be having serial growth scans at intervals between every 2 and 4 weeks until delivery. When Alice gave birth to Smokey, who had died in the course of labour at 41 plus 3 by this point, she hadn't had a scan for over 5 weeks. Her scan stopped at 36 weeks. And this, she claims and fears, is because of something specific that Oxford University Hospitals Trust does. So in 2016, they introduced a new scanning pathway with the best of intentions to kind of reduce the worst outcomes in pregnancy, babies dying. And they wanted to try to identify earlier the pregnancies where these terrible outcomes could happen, the high-risk pregnancies. So what they did is at the 20-week scan, instead of what most hospitals do, where only high-risk women receive this extra thing, which is called a uterine artery Doppler scan, which essentially measures the blood flow from mum to baby. Every woman Every woman had that at 20 weeks, along with the standard scan. And then they also introduced a third scan, which most women don't get across the NHS. You get your 12-week scan, you get the 20-week scan. In Oxford, you also get a 36-week scan. Now, there's nothing wrong with that per se. Some women, it's really comforting to get a 36-week scan or any additional scan, but it isn't recommended by NICE explicitly because there's no evidence that it actually is beneficial. And the argument here is that the extra resources needed to scan between 7,000 and 8,000 women again means that scan requests outside of this pathway are being turned down, like Alice's. And we discovered in the course of our investigation that, in fact, a couple of obstetricians from Oxford had given presentations on this pathway and what they had found, their results. And they said this is possible with, quote, strict policing of other scans. One obstetrician said that we refuse half of all the additional referrals that they're receiving. And another, speaking in 2022, said we pay for this policy by strictly policing scans outside this. So this is where the concern comes in, and this is now what Wes Streeting has asked NHS England to investigate. Now, the trusts say we're not running counter to guidelines, and they point to a research paper that the team did, and they said, look, we observed drops actually in our stillbirth rate and our neonatal mortality outcomes. But what they neglected to say is that very same paper, the next sentence says neither of these changes are statistically significant, and their own conclusion from their own research team says that the benefits are unknown, they're unclear. So their own team have concluded as yet, and this research is ongoing. The latest paper from this year, which looked at 7 years of data from this pathway, also show unclear. Now, they have also indicated that you mentioned that for the latest stats that we have, which is 2023, they did have the worst stillbirth rate in the country. They've indicated that when the new stats come out, they will be better. We clearly haven't seen those and they're not published, but that is their response to these allegations.
Wow. Well, firstly, Hannah, what another devastating story. And I know you've got several examples of families that you've spoken to with really heartbreaking testimony in your really hard-hitting article. And again, thank you to those families for sharing their stories, because I'm afraid that is what gets government to sit up and pay attention and to take action. So I suppose the key question for me today then, Hannah, is you've done this incredibly important investigation, and thank you for taking the time to do it over so many months and to listen to families and to hear their stories. But I suppose the question is now, what next? What is the government going to do about it? So do you have a sense that there is going to be, this new maternity investigation, which Baroness Amos is leading, is that going to resolve many of these issues? And what is the next step for these families affected in Oxford?
Well, it's interesting because in part of their response to us, the Trust said that it hoped that Baroness Amos's investigation would look into many, if not all, the cases that we raised. Now, my understanding is that simply will not happen. The Amos review has made it clear that it will not be investigating individual cases because it doesn't have the capacity to do that. It's looking more thematically at what the issues are across England. So I don't think that is going to happen. Certainly, NHS England will be looking specifically at this pathway, and there are some other aspects of the investigation which Wes Streeting has asked to get more information on as well, particularly this sort of what's been going on in the background with some of the members of the campaign group and how they've been treated but by those with connections to the Trust and the Trust themselves. So we very much hope that as a result of this, that care will improve. I don't know if it will. There seems to be a commitment from the Trust to work with these families to improve services, but it's very difficult to say. I mean, it's striking actually that some of the families we spoke to had raised their concerns multiple times over a long period, they wrote to MPs, they wrote to health officials, they wrote to regulatory bodies, and in some cases they received no response until the media stepped in, and that really, that can't be right. It happens too often. And why is it that it requires journalists to tell these stories when surely the regulators, people in authority should be aware of this already? I think it's an open question, but we hope that improvements will be made as a result. But I don't think, and this is meant as no disrespect or attempt to undermine the Amos review, but the things we've revealed and unearthed will not be able to be tackled by the Amos review.
Well, I think that's always been my concern, Hannah, is that she was given an incredibly difficult task in a very short time frame in which to do it. And I think it's fair to say I don't think the government will be reporting in December their full findings because they simply haven't had the time to review and gather the evidence. But I hope that they will, take the time to listen very carefully to the stories of your investigation and to learn the lessons. And it reminds me of when I did the birth trauma inquiry in Parliament last year with this cross-party committee of MPs. We in fact called our report Listen to Mums, because we felt, as you did, that families were not being listened to by NHS healthcare professionals and people in the position of power and influence to change it. So just finally, Hannah, if you had any policymakers today listening to today's episode, what would be the one lesson and the key reflection that you'd like them to hear from your report to try and affect positive change for mums?
Oh my gosh, what a tough one to answer. I think, I like to sort of take a step back. So I won't be calling. I know many families want a public inquiry and some don't. So I'm not going to go there and call for policies. But what I do think is that there is clearly a cultural problem across maternity services, because you can look at trusts where everything else, all their other areas of treatment are kind of fine. They're actually doing really well, but their maternity service is failing. And to me, that indicates that something else is going wrong. And I spoke actually with a midwife who had left Oxford as part of the investigation, and she said, she made the point that no one goes into medicine, and particularly not obstetrics or midwifery, to harm women and their babies. Of course, it's the very opposite. But I think what we've seen is compassion fatigue, certainly in Oxford, and I'm sure pretty much up and down the country. And that actually doesn't cost money. It doesn't cost money to treat women with dignity, to listen to them, to explain what is going on if it's going wrong. So for doctors and for midwives, they see this every day, but for women, they'll do it once, twice, 3 times in their lives, and it's frightening. And when you don't know what's going on, particularly when things are not going as planned, it's really helpful to understand that. And I think a change in culture whereby when things do go wrong, even if it's as a result of there's no fault, but to be honest about what's happened and to explain and to be willing to sit down and talk with families and not be defensive, to be open. I think those are things that could change very easily without any money. That would be my message, I think.
Well, I totally agree with that, Hannah. And just to finish the episode off, I'm always reminded that when I was an MP, the most shocking statistic I always heard was that the government was spending more on medical negligence compensation payouts than actually on the frontline services in maternity in our British hospitals. So clearly we have to have a proper review of the culture in the NHS and to work out what is the best way to provide safe levels of maternity care. Well, Hannah, thank you so much for coming on Breaking the Taboo and speaking about such an important subject, but also for your incredibly important investigation. There is a link in the show notes to the full article in the New Statesman on Britain's Next Maternity Scandal. Do read it in full and also check out the videos of the families that they've interviewed with Channel 4. And if you've enjoyed today's episode, please do rate it on wherever the platform that you get your podcasts, whether it's iTunes or Spotify or others. And also please do share this with friends and family. We want the podcast to reach as many people as possible. Well, can I thank Hannah for coming into the studio today, and stay tuned for next week's episode of Breaking the Taboo. Bye-bye for now.